Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Todd Eby. I'm the Manager of Project Review here at the Commission. I'll be the moderator today for the webinar. We're going to get started shortly, but I wanted to mention that the chat box is active for entering questions at any time during the webinar. The session is being recorded. We expect to have about a 45-minute presentation followed by a question and answer period. And before we get started with the webinar, I'd just ask Andrew Dayhoff, our Executive Director here at the Commission, if you'd like to provide a couple opening remarks.
Yes, thanks, Todd. I would. Good afternoon, everybody. As you know, today's topic is operational monitoring and testing, which really boils down to data and data collection. If you had to choose only one out of this series of webinars, in my opinion, this one is the must-see TV of the group. I honestly don't think we can overstate the importance of data. Yes, I acknowledge that we are scientists and engineers and geologists, and we love all the data points that we can get our hands and eyes on. And certainly, having the right data will be of tremendous benefit to you in achieving streamlined and mutually agreeable renewals and approvals to your groundwater withdrawals. But I think it's also important to emphasize that the information you collect about your well's operations, that really is your eyes and ears on your sources. It's like your gas gauge and oil pressure and temperature gauge on your car, telling you whether things are operating within expected parameters or if you're heading off in a bad direction. And the good news is that even if you haven't been or aren't already collecting some of that data, it's never too late to start. So welcome again. I'll just sum up by saying that we consider data to be so critical that we are looking at some new and exciting ways to assist you in collecting it. So please stay tuned for more information on that front. I think we'll have some news down the road here that you'll want to hear. So thanks again for your interest and participation. If you weren't or won't be available for the other webinars in this series, they were and will be recorded and available for you to view at your convenience. I definitely encourage you to check them out. Also encourage you to complete the survey that you'll receive following today's session, as that feedback really helps us ensure that we're putting together as valuable a workshop as we can to meet your interests and needs. Thank you, Todd. Back to you.
Thanks, Drew. We're going to get started with the presentation. Today we're going to have three presenters. We're going to have Mike Appleby, the Supervisor of Groundwater in Project Review, Scott McFeeters, he is a hydrogeologist in the Project Review program, and Dave Hackler, who's an aquatic biologist, environmental scientist in the Project Review program. We'll start out with Mike Appleby.
Thanks, Todd. This is Mike Appleby. I am the Groundwater Supervisor for the Commission. Wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. We're very excited to, again, have this good a participation in this webinar series. We definitely appreciate everybody tuning into this, so this should be good. As has been mentioned, this is part 2 of this webinar series that we're working on. We're going to talk about operational monitoring and operational testing and what those differences are. Consistent with the last webinar, we're loosely following the new fact sheet that was recently provided to you with your invite for this webinar. So you can follow along with that or refer to it later on. And as with the prior webinar, we'd also ask that you check in with these fact sheets periodically to see how things change. As we work on constantly improving our renewal process, we expect that there will be some updates to these fact sheets as we move along, and also to help address some of the questions that we may receive throughout the process. So stay tuned for that. Those are always available on our website. I wanted to start off with a very brief recap of the prior webinar. There were a couple of key points that were mentioned in that webinar that are probably worth going back over just to make sure that people understand them and to reinforce their importance. Obviously, the title of the last webinar was a two-step process. So to go along with that, there are 2 steps in the renewal process. Starting off with the aquifer testing plan or waiver request, and then following up with a groundwater withdrawal application. It's important to recognize that the application deadline is 6 months prior to the expiration of your approval. and that the waiver or plan submittal does not count for that. Therefore, we want to make sure that projects are moving along in an appropriate fashion to get that 6-month renewal deadline taken care of, and we have some processes to work through that. So you may remember that we talked about releasing the application a little bit, and that's something that I talk about very often in pre-application meetings. So just contact us about releasing the application from the waiver or offer testing plan. The other thing that came up that was new was the last webinar that a lot of people didn't know about, and I've actually received a few calls to follow up on this, is that projects that have already met the aquifer testing requirement of 806.12 do not need to redo an aquifer test, or they do not need to complete a waiver, so they can move straight to the application phase. So there are some projects out there where the first step was satisfied years ago with the original aquifer testing plan that was completed. So moving on for the topic of today's webinar, Scott and Dave are going to talk a lot about identifying data gaps, how operational monitoring and testing is conducted, what they are, what the difference is between them, and which one may be appropriate for your project. The final part of the webinar, it's really kind of part 2 of it, is Scott's going to go through a discussion of some of the voluntary action plans that the Commission has been preparing for eligible public water supply assistance program projects. It's a subset of projects going through the renewal process that the Commission is working with to develop these plans. And Scott's going to go through a couple of examples of those to illustrate what we're expecting and what the process can be. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Scott McPheeters to get started in his portion of the program.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott McPheeters. I'm a hydrogeologist here at the Commission. And today, as we begin our talk, we want to focus on the data that is needed for a renewal application. First thing I want to do is just kind of refresh our memory on the purpose of the application, and that is the data provided with the application needs to satisfy Commission Regulation 806.23. Within that regulation, there are basically 3 questions that a project sponsor needs to be able to answer. They're on your screen there. So first of all, is the requested withdrawal rate sustainable? Can you demonstrate that you are not going to adversely impact the aquifer? Second question, will your withdrawal cause any adverse impacts to other users? And the third one, can you demonstrate that you won't cause any impacts to environmental resources? So if you have data in your possession that you can answer those questions with, that's a good start, and you may not have a lot to do as you prepare your application. But what we find many times is that a sponsor will have 1 or more data gaps that they need to be able to fill in order to submit their application. What we want to do today is take some time and review the common data gaps that we typically see and give you a little bit of insight on how you can go about filling those gaps. The first common data gap we're going to talk about is related to the sustainable withdrawal question. So typically, a groundwater availability analysis will help you be able to demonstrate if the withdrawal is going to be sustainable if you have enough recharge to sustain your withdrawal. So I've listed here a couple of the key concepts or key components of an availability analysis. And you'll notice under 1A, I've underlined the word reasonable, and we really just want to kind of request that as you complete an analysis, you put some thought into what you're doing. Don't just fill in an analysis to check off the box. But we've seen some good examples of availability analysis completed where folks take the time and do a topographic delineation to identify their basin or use the results of an aquifer test to define an area of influence, combine that with groundwater flow direction, and really come up with some good basins. On the same hand, we've also seen a few points where they're not necessarily the most reasonable, where they might identify, an example would be where you identify a lake maybe 10,000 feet to the west, and you think your recharge is coming from there, but when you look at the test data, you're really demonstrating that you're drawing water from a creek to the east, and it just doesn't make sense when you put when you look at the science behind it. So again, with all these concepts here, identifying a 1 in 10 year recharge rate, there's lots of good resources out there. Just ask that you go ahead and take some time, put a little thought into it. As far as the other groundwater users, try to come up with a realistic estimate. If you're presenting a 15 square mile recharge basin and you've got one other user, Joe Smith's well, we might question that. But the reality is, we realize it's not an exact science. We're not going to try to account for every drop of water within your basin. But when you go through this exercise, if you come up with a estimate of the water usage of about 50%, that's going to tell us, hey, it looks like the water's available. We've also seen the instances where we get the submittals where the water usage is 800%, and it's going to kind of raise a flag saying, hey, is that quantity of water really available? So it's kind of a good screening tool to take this step. And again, the ultimate goal here is to assure that you will have the sustainable water for the future that you are looking to withdraw. So it's really to your benefit to complete a good groundwater availability analysis. A second common data gap we will commonly see is related to aquifer testing. So the first question you really want to do as you're contemplating whether or not you have the data is ask yourself, do you have a previously approved test from the SRBC? If you do, that's good news for you. That it might result in you having to do very minimal work to get a renewal. But as most of you out there probably realize, you may not have that pre-approved test, and so then it comes down to what kind of data do you actually have. So if you look at item C there, many sponsors have testing data, but we often see some issues with those, and I've listed a couple there. They can be single well tests, not be to be a short duration as opposed to a 72-hour test, or maybe the test was completed on a test well as opposed to a production well in its final form. The thing I want to stress here is that maybe a test cannot stand on its own to give you the renewal, but any aquifer testing data you have, maybe in conjunction with some other testing or other data like operational monitoring data or your site setting, maybe we can use that data in combination with some other data to help fill a data gap. So just be aware of that. So a third common data gap we see is related to the historical operations data. So what we often find, or sometimes we find, is that a good record of operational data can be better than having a 72-hour test. And the key there are items A and B. We need to have withdrawal data and water level data. We need both pieces of that puzzle to help us see what's really going on in the aquifer. And again, item B, the longer the data record we have, the better. Because we want to look at what's happening over time under different pumping conditions, whether it's a wet season, a dry season, whether you're pumping at a low rate or a high rate. So an extended period is a lot better than just a couple months or a short period of time. So I'll direct your attention to the graph I have there on this slide. I know you're not going to be able to make out the detail of it, but I just want to refer to a couple features of that graph. If you look at it, there are two main lines that you can see. There's a blue line and a purple line. The blue line represents the groundwater level data for this particular well, and the purple line represents the 30-day average that withdrawal that has been reported over time for this well. The really good feature of this data set is that it extends across the full range of, it's a continuous line across the full range there, and that scale is a 15-year period. So this particular sponsor had a very good record of data for both water levels and withdrawals, and we were able to use that to come up with, to point out that there's not a data gap in this, for that particular project. Common problems we have there under item C, you know, sometimes we don't have any water level data. We determine that the water level data we have is static conditions as opposed to pumping. And the last one listed under item C is one that we come across quite a bit that results in a gap, is that there may be operational withdrawal data available, but it is not at the rate that is looking to be approved. And that really becomes an issue because we want to be able to say that we can demonstrate the requested rate is sustainable, but if you don't have data at that rate, it really leaves that gap there that we're not able to answer that question. So this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dave Hackler to talk about the fourth data gap.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. My name is Dave Hackler, and I'm an environmental scientist in our project review program. I'm going to talk about the fourth data gap, environmental resources, as well as operational monitoring and testing. So to get started, setting matters. Wells are often constructed in close proximity to environmental resources such as springs, streams, and wetlands. There's a dynamic balance between meeting system demands while avoiding adverse impacts to these environmental resources. Some resources can be identified as sensitive by using online mapping programs, conducting resource surveys, conducting coordination, confirmed on site, or in combination of all. Sensitive resources are regulated and protected by resource agencies to ensure avoidance of adverse impacts. Sensitive resources include headwater settings. These could be streams less than 10 square mile drainage, wild trout streams, rare, threatened, and endangered, or RTE species, as well as high-quality wetlands. You need to ask yourself, were these sensitive resources monitored during previous testing? Do they exist near my well? Why? Because sensitive environmental resources will typically be considered for monitoring during operational testing for existing well withdrawals, given their protected and regulated status. Common environmental resource-based data gaps include surface water monitoring. The most common problems are a lack of monitoring, so no data at all. Or second, if you have available testing data, it may not include the current sensitive resources near your site at this time. The second data gap is sensitive resources themselves. Good example, wild trout and RTE species. RTE species could include, for example, the bog turtle. These are the most common sensitive resources identified during the renewal process. Their presence can elevate the protection and regulatory requirements for the streams and wetlands they inhabit. They also require partner agency coordination to determine their potential as a data gap. Another consideration for environmental resources are changes proposed to your operations. Environmental resources can normalize in form, function, and value to natural and anthropogenic changes over time. The Commission and partner resource agencies will consider operational aspects of a project when assessing environmental resources as data gaps. So with that, we've identified the 4 common data gaps, and really, how do you go about filling those data gaps? Well, you can do some through operational monitoring and operational testing. Both operational monitoring and operational testing are completed during operation of a withdrawal, allow use of the water for system needs, will require monitoring of the production well, and can include water level, adjacent wells, and surface water monitoring. So how are they different? Operational monitoring is completed during normal system operations and generally includes monitoring of the production well itself, it can include expanded monitoring of adjacent wells and surface water features, while operational testing involves strategic changes in pumping rate, was considered an expanded withdrawal of the production well, and it can also include the expanded monitoring. Some factors that influence monitoring versus testing are the nature of your data gaps. So the data gaps we just outlined, are there potential impacts to sustainability, other users, or the environment that would require expanded monitoring or expanded withdrawal? The time available. A key distinction is monitoring is typically a longer duration, lower effort undertaking. Testing is typically a shorter duration, higher effort task, which can also end up being close to a traditional constant rate aquifer test. Historical testing and available operational data, how big are these gaps? Filling minor gaps can usually be completed with operational monitoring, where a larger complete data set can be generated with testing. With these factors in mind, there are also some considerations. Considerations when addressing data gaps to assess impacts to the environment, you first must ensure that the equipment for operational monitoring or testing meets construction requirements of partner resource agencies. The monitoring equipment should be temporary, installed less than a few months, ideally weeks to months. Monitoring equipment should be installed by hand, never with heavy machinery. Please do not fire up the old excavator, as fun as they could be. The goal of monitoring is to gather useful data using appropriate equipment while avoiding stream and resource disturbances. For example, weirs can be used when stream channel does not exceed several feet in width. Flumes could be installed to allow stream flow and passage for wild trout and aquatic communities. Paired piezometers can be used in wetlands and larger streams where stream bank and stream bed monitoring is recommended to detect hydraulic connection. More information on monitoring methods can be found in the Commission's Aquifer Test Guidance, which is published on our website. When addressing data gaps to assess impacts to other users, you first may want to monitor adjacent private and public wells. This is very ideally done with permission during monitoring and testing. Getting consent can be difficult since some folks do not want a transducer in their well. Understandable. If you encounter issues, the Commission can help you establish your monitoring network. It's best to create a well inventory for the project area or its estimated area of influence from which you can generate your monitoring network. It's best to ensure your monitoring network is a representative subset of wells drilled at varying depths and constructed in areas which could experience impact. When addressing data gaps to assess sustainability, remember, you're monitoring and testing your production well. Can all water be withdrawn, be used for the system? Can water be safely discharged away from the well if it's not used? These are some of those considerations. You want to consider timing, the duration. Will operational testing disrupt the normal operations and demands of your system? You want to consider withdrawal rates. Can your existing equipment handle an increased pumping rate? And it's very important to periodically log your drawdown data during pumping and recovery data when the pumping stops. This isn't really a set it and forget it. It's best if you can provide this data periodically throughout your monitoring. Water level monitoring is very important for assessing impacts to sustainability and other users. It can be collected with different methods, manually, with airlines or pressure transducers. These methods are typically tied to available cost and system infrastructure. The Commission will be talking about water level monitoring in greater detail in next month's webinar. Remember, the goal of operational monitoring and testing is to fill in the data gap. It is in your best interest to consider a pre-application meeting and contact staff regularly throughout this process. With staff's helping role in mind, I'm going to pass the presentation back to Mike to provide information about the Commission's Voluntary Action Plan approach.
Thanks, Dave. So that basically was part one of this webinar. Part two is going to focus a little bit more on some specific examples from the action plans that the Commission has been developing for projects that are eligible to participate in the Public Water Supply Assistance Program. But whether or not you are one of those projects that can participate, we think that there is a fair amount of value in developing an action plan similar to what we would create, because it summarizes what the evaluation that has already been completed indicates, helps to identify where the project needs to go and what supplemental data is necessary. And all of that information will eventually be needed to help support your waiver. So whether you have an action plan developed by the Commission, or if you have an action plan that you need to develop on your own with the help of a consultant, we think there's a lot of value in putting some of that down on paper so that you have something in writing to reference later on. The action plans are not required, so this is up to you to decide if you want to do. But again, we feel like they're a good start to your waiver, so we do recommend you completing them. For projects that are participating in the Public Water Supply Assistance Program, and those are municipal public water supply projects that are serving 10,000 people or fewer, the Commission can complete a voluntary action plan for your project. So what we do with that is we work through the data evaluation that Dave and Scott were talking about in the first part of this webinar. We write that down and develop some recommendations for you for moving forward with the second part, which is collecting the operational monitoring or testing as needed. So the voluntary action plan, as the name suggests, is voluntary, but it's important to note that the renewal part of that is not if you want to continue with the source. So you can decide how to proceed with the Public Water Supply Assistance Program as you wish if you're eligible to participate. You can meet with us on site. We'll take a look at the data that you have, do a field meeting. Then you provide some information to us. We do the evaluation Scott and Dave mentioned, and then we'll write this up into a plan. At any point during that process, you can decide to stop. You can decide not to implement the plan as we've recommended it to you, and you can go about your own evaluation as you want to. What we've been finding as we've been working through the action plans that there are several classes of outcomes that are common. The first and most often is that there is some supplemental data that is necessary. So a project was able to answer one or two of the questions that Scott and David talked about, but they might not be able to answer whether or not there's an impact to the environment. Often that was something that was overlooked in prior testing. So we might recommend that there's some supplemental data collection necessary, whether it's through operational monitoring or operational testing. Rarely we find that a complete aquifer test is necessary. And we're hoping that through this outreach that we're doing with these webinars and the fact sheets and participation with the program, that full aquifer testing is not going to be necessary, because most projects have the ability to collect at least some data that's going to help them, and then they can target the other data so that there's less work that's involved. Aquifer testing is expensive, and we want to try to avoid that expense if at all possible. So as we were working through the voluntary action plan reviews, and as Scott primarily was doing most of the work on these, we came to realize that by the time we are finished with our review, there has already been a complete hydrogeologic evaluation done for this project. So for some projects that don't have to collect any additional data and that the data is supportive of a potential request of a quantity for a withdrawal from the well, they have the option to take SRBC's review that is provided in the voluntary action plan and use that as their own evaluation. If they choose to do that, they would not need to complete any additional hydrogeologic evaluation. This would satisfy any waiver requirements as well as any hydrogeologic evaluation requirements of a groundwater withdrawal application. So this is something that is not well advertised by the Commission. This is the first time really that this has been said outside of the action plan. So I would imagine that some of the calls that I'll be getting later today and tomorrow are going to be related to how a project can get through this SRBC review. So it's important to note that there may be a quantity that is supportable with existing data and without collecting any new data, but it may not be the quantity that you want. Or it could also be that the project sponsor would take a look at the data they provided and have a different interpretation. So they are free to either accept our review and move through the application process, or they can collect some additional data, provide a new interpretation of the data that's already provided, and provide their own hydrogeologic evaluation. So any of these options are available to them. It's really up to them to decide how they want to go forward. One of the reasons that we decided to provide that option, because it didn't seem worthwhile having a project sponsor have to hire a consultant to do the same evaluation that we've just done if they're willing to accept our results. So that's a little bit of a wrinkle that's going to be new to most people. So the next step here is that Scott is going to go over a couple of examples for voluntary action plans that the Commission has prepared recently, and give a couple of examples that hopefully will highlight the type of work that is necessary and the types of things that we're routinely identifying. So, Scott?
Thanks, Mike. So, yeah, I'm going to cover 3 examples. They're going to be of real projects. I have changed the names here. You'll be seeing references to Site A, Site B, Site C, instead of the real project name. Before I get started, I want to just kind of explain the table you see before you on this slide. I'm going to be putting this slide up, this type of a table, for each of the sources I'm talking about. And basically, there's 5 rows in the table. We've talked about 4 potential data gaps, or common data gaps. So you'll see each of those 4 listed in the far left column. And the first item, the first row, states status of 806.12. And what that really is doing is it's checking on whether or not you have a previously approved test by the Commission. So each of these boxes, we're going to go down through them and explain what we reviewed for each project. You'll see a check mark in whether the information was satisfactory or not satisfactory. If there's a check in the satisfactory, it's not necessarily a data gap. If it's in the not satisfactory, it's a potential data gap. And I share that because you don't necessarily need all 5 boxes checked for no data gap. If you can use some combination of the data you have to answer the questions, you may be able to do limited or no additional work. So just to put that out there as we get into these examples. The first example, Site A, brief background on that is the project sponsor came to us. They have 2 wells that are coming in for renewal. The site is in northern Pennsylvania. It is an unconsolidated alluvial deposit aquifer. And so as we started looking at the data that we had in our files and that the sponsor was able to provide us, the first question there was, did they have a pre-approved test for this well, well A? And in this case, they did not. So we dig into the data a little deeper. As we looked at the setting, there was a good groundwater availability there. So that one, there was no potential data gap. We dug into the operational data, and for this particular project, they had some good operational data where they had water levels, they had withdrawal rates, and an important aspect here is that they had the data during a drought where they pumped at the previously approved rate and did not show a negative impact to the aquifer. So that was really important for this particular project, especially when you look at the next line where did they have historical testing data. They did not have an aquifer test. They had some specific capacity tests, some short-term testing. So the testing itself would be a data gap. And the last item there, when we looked at sensitive environmental resources, there was very limited natural resources in the area, so there did not appear to be a gap there. So when we look at all this data, the very bottom of the slide, the key here for this particular well A1, is that they had some good historical operations data during the drought. So there was a second well on this site and I'll go over that before we go over the conclusions and recommendations. So the second well, if you look at the first line, a good feature for this particular well is that it did have a previously approved SRBC test. And you go down through, it wasn't beside the other well, but it was in the same general area, so the availability was good. As far as operational data, we had some operational data, a decent record of that, but the shortcoming there and why this was a potential gap is because the well was approved for withdrawal up to a certain quantity, and the well has only historically been operated at about 50% of that approved quantity. So the operational data by itself would not be able to support the renewal. But where this well really benefits is it did have the pre-approved test. It was a good test when we reviewed the data. It had a good monitoring network. It was at the rate they're requesting, and we did not find any other data that would suggest the test data was no longer valid. And again, it didn't have many sensitive environmental resources. So the summary of looking into the data for this well is that the key is that it had the previously approved test, and there was nothing to suggest the test was no longer valid. So when we get to the end of this with Site A, we developed some options for this site. So looking at well A1, by regulation, a waiver would typically be required for this well because it did not have a previously approved test. As Mike introduced the idea previously, what happens for well A1 if this particular sponsor chooses to renew at the previously approved rate, they do not have to submit a waiver because the SRBC Voluntary Action Plan will serve as that waiver. And the other good part for a sponsor is that there will be no fee. Even though a waiver should be required, if they accept the findings of the Voluntary Action Plan, they will not have to submit a waiver and not have to pay that fee. Likewise, if they do want a higher rate, they will have to do some testing. Again, if we look at well A2, this well had the previously approved test, therefore a waiver is not required. And if they want to renew at the previously approved rate, they can go straight to the application phase, not have to mess around with a waiver. Similar to well A1, though, if they did want a higher rate than what was previously approved, testing would be done. So all in all, Site A is in pretty good shape when it comes to renewing. So we'll move on to Site B. Again, this will be a little bit different setting. This particular project sponsor had one well that was up for renewal. The project is in New York State. It's in a glacial valley, and it did not have a previously approved SRBC test. So moving on down through the data that we looked at, there was good availability in the vicinity of this well. It was a good aquifer. It had a large groundwater contribution basin. But as we went through the data, there were some concerns identified as far as the operational data. We had some data, but the background on this well, it was in particular, it was a backup well for their system, so it was not operated frequently. So we had minimal withdrawal data. We had no water level data. So again, the operational data was not would serve as would classify as a possible data gap. It could not serve by itself to support the requested withdrawal. In this case, there was a historical 72-hour test. Some issues with that, though. There was a limited monitoring network, and the good news, though, it was operated during the test at a higher rate than what it was ultimately approved. And keep that in mind as we get to the recommendation section. So the test on itself could not stand by itself to answer all the questions. But when we get to the recommendations, it was an important point or an important piece of information that we had this 72-hour test to refer to. Regarding the sensitive species, no species present, some regulated wetlands did show up, but they were on the outskirts of the expected area of influence based on testing. There was a river nearby, but so ultimately, because there was no monitoring or limited monitoring with the testing, this shows up as a possible data gap. So, you know, in summary, before I get into the conclusions, it had a decent test. It has a good setting, but there are some potential data gaps that need to be thought about during the renewal process. So the voluntary action plan, here's where it went with recommendations. The idea is that the well does need a waiver because it did not have a previously approved rate or previously approved test. If they want to renew at the previously tested rate, they are going to have to do some short-term operational monitoring, basically to confirm the results of the previous test. So maybe not a 72-hour test, maybe some short-term testing and look at the results and make sure it compares favorably with the previous test. One of the pieces of information as far as data gaps, make sure the other users are, there's not other users that could be impacted, so they would have to do some evaluation there. They would not be able to use the SRBC action plan as their waiver because additional data is needed. And again, as always, if higher rates are desired, testing would be needed for that. So that's kind of a summary of Site B. Got one more here we want to cover, Site C, and you know, I'm trying to give you the full gamut of examples here. Site C is a single well in southern Pennsylvania in the Piedmont area. As you look at some of the data we reviewed, it did not have a previous aquifer test, so that box could not be checked. As we looked at this data, it was in a very small headwater setting, and looking at the quantities that are looking to be renewed, there is questionable availability. So quite frankly, we need some additional data here to confirm availability. Operational data, there was a record of operational data, but one of the common things we often see is that it is not at the rate that is being approved or being requested. In this case, it was a maximum of about 80%, with typical operation around 60% of the request of the approved. So the operational data can't stand on its own to support this withdrawal. There was issues with the historical testing. There was a test done, but it was a multi-rate test. There was a recharge barrier encounter, and there was a nearby wetland that is suspected of impact, or did show an influence during testing. So again, there's some potential data gaps looking at the historical test results. I'm going to bring Dave Hackler back in here just to talk about some of the sensitive species that were encountered, or sensitive environmental resources are encountered with Site C. Dave?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I just wanted to highlight, as part of our voluntary action plan process, environmental review staff generate an environmental resource inventory for each project. Site C is a case of an existing well being constructed in close proximity to sensitive natural resources. Through desktop analysis, it was identified that the well is located within 100 feet of a wetland. On further inspection, this wetland sources a wild trout stream and is delineated in an area that may contain the bog turtle, a federally threatened species. So at this point, these sensitive resources were identified because of the presence of wild trout and potential bog turtle. This wetland was identified as a potential data gap by staff, which needed to be confirmed with partner resource agencies. Partner resource agencies later determined that the wetland would require monitoring to assess for impacts as a data gap in order for the project sponsor to renew at previously approved or increased rate.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So, yeah, go ahead. So just moving on, so with a bunch of potential data gaps there, what recommendations did we come up with here? So off the top, a waiver is needed for this project because there wasn't a previous approved test. If the sponsor desires to have the previous rate approved, they're going to have to do some operational testing with some monitoring, and the data is going to need to be able to demonstrate that there's no impacts to surface water or wetlands. They're going to have to be able to use the new data to be able to support the recharge area, to make sure that there's sufficient recharge available. And again, in this case, they're going to have to submit a waiver to us because extra or additional data is needed to fill these data gaps. Certainly, if a higher rate is needed at well C, testing would be needed, and in this case would most likely not be recommended. So that's a variety of examples that we covered there, A through C. At this point, I'll pass it back to Mike Appleby to wrap up the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So that helps to, those three examples help to demonstrate the variability that you can expect to see across some of these projects, where some people are going to have to do very little work and some people might have some more extensive work to do. And it's all based on that setting. So as part of that, we kind of recommend that you get started very early in that process to understand where you are and what work is going to be necessary. So with that, there's a couple of closing slides here that don't really need any attention, so I would suggest that if you have any questions, you can go ahead and get started on writing that up in the chat, and I'll go through these fairly quickly. So there's a couple of additional resources that are listed here, as well as contact information for key staff involved in these processes. Up next, we do want to plug the next webinar, which, as Drew alluded to, will have some interesting features for projects that are undergoing the renewal. So it's going to be worthwhile attending that webinar to see what it is that we have in store for you. We are still looking at another series of webinars starting sometime in April, possibly looking at alpha testing plan waivers. So the summary that we want you to walk away with is get started on this process early. Give yourself enough time to collect the data at your own pace and contact Commission staff early and often. We're here to try to help you through this process. Something new that came out of this webinar today is that there may be an SRBC hydrogeologic evaluation process that's available to you if you're eligible for the Public Water Supply Assistance Program. So anybody that thinks they may be eligible for that, I would suggest that you contact us, and we can get you started on that. We think that there's a lot of value for public water suppliers working through that process with us, and hopefully the ones that have been able to accept our review would agree with that. As what's been mentioned in this webinar and the prior webinar, we want you to utilize the existing data to the extent that you can and collect only the additional data that you need to answer those three questions that keep coming up. Those three questions are very important, and sustainability impacts other users and impacts the environment. Those are the three things that we routinely mention to people, and those are the questions that we need to answer. And then finally, we have a quote from Ronald Reagan. I've used this one before, but I kind of like it. It's the 9 scariest words in the English language. We're from the government. We're here to help. So hopefully you do find that this is useful, particularly projects that can take on the voluntary action plans. But as part of that, we want to be involved in this process and help you as much as we can. We recognize that there are projects that we're not going to be able to provide the direct and system-specific assistance, but we are available for pre-application calls. If your consultant develops an action plan for you and you want to have a pre-application meeting before they actually implement the action plan, we'd be happy to do that. We'll give a cursory review to it and try to highlight things that we think are potential issues or things that are covered very well. So we do want to help you through this process to the extent we can. So it looks like there are a couple of questions in the chat box, so we're going to wrap up the webinar and switch over to those questions. Todd?
Thanks, Mike. Before we get started on the Q&A, I just wanted to cover a few things in case anybody has to leave early. We want to thank everyone for participating today. There will be, like we mentioned previously, there will be an electronic survey that will be provided by an email following this session. We ask that you provide some feedback with that by answering those surveys. It's very helpful to us in making sure that we're providing information that is useful, and then we can react to any kind of feedback we get to make sure that we continue to work on and improve these offerings. We will be providing a copy of a recording and frequently asked questions document up on our website in the next couple of weeks following the conclusion of this webinar. And the Part 1 webinar materials are already up on our website. And then I just want to mention that the Part 3, the water level monitoring webinar, will be on March 25th, and we hope that you can join us for that one. So, Mike, we have a couple questions here. I think maybe this one, Mike will probably hit on the fact that the answer to this is not always as clear as what people would like, but the first question is, what is an adverse impact?
Yeah, that's one of those questions that is a little bit fuzzy. We often are asked that. And what we're actually looking for, to make it even potentially a little bit fuzzier, is significant adverse impact. So we're not just looking for something that's adverse, because you could consider almost any kind of an impact to be adverse from one respect or another. We're looking for something that's going to be significant. So when you're talking about impacts to other users, it's going to be something that affects their ability to utilize their source. So it may be lowering the water level in their well to a point where their own use causes them to have water supply issues, could cause some water quality issues. There's various things with that. From an environmental standpoint, it's something that's going to affect, adversely affect the character and extent of wetlands, the ability of the surface water features to support habitat. So it could also be limiting the amount of flow that's in a surface water feature. So to go along with some of the surface water impacts, we'd also have a low flow protection policy that helps to define what we would consider to be a significant adverse impact under those. So I would recommend that you pull that up. It's available on our website. And again, that's the low flow protection policy.
Great, thanks, Mike. Second one is a really good question, because climate change is a frequently discussed topic right now. And so the question is, with changing land use and increased areas of impervious surfaces, as well as climate change, are past tests still valid?
Yeah, so I have a standard answer for that, which is it depends. And I know that that's not a very satisfying answer, but it's one that I often have to give, because as Dave mentioned, the site location matters. There's everything about the sensitive nature of the site that could make a difference in it. So there are projects that we have seen yields of some of their sources decrease because of the increase of impervious cover, and that certainly would indicate then that the test may no longer be valid. So something like that, there may be some additional work that is necessary. For the most part, historic tests, generally speaking, would still be considered to be valid. And one of the things that we like to do with that is compare historic testing to current operational data. And we do that to determine if that historic test is adequately representing conditions that are being observed today. So in other words, if the maximum drawdown in the production well was projected to be 100 feet at 500 gallons a minute, but the well's only being operated at 250 gallons a minute, and you're seeing 150 feet of drawdown, that indicates that that testing that was done before is no longer representative of what's happening today. So when you combine that with things that are happening with climate change, with impervious surface, that's part of the reason that we have the renewal process, is to continually reevaluate whether or not there's something that was either wrong with the prior tests, or if there's something that has changed in the environment that needs to be addressed. Some of the changes that could happen in the environment could actually be the reintroduction of some RTE species. whereas maybe it wasn't present before or wasn't evaluated before, but now it's noted to exist nearby. So we need to make sure that those features are protected moving forward.
Great, thanks, Mike. The next question is, are there areas where development should be limited because of current water resource limitations? So I'll just provide some response to this question first, and then I'll ask Mike if he has anything to add. The short answer is yes. There are some areas that additional development should be limited, and those types of areas need to be evaluated very carefully. In those areas, the evaluation of data gaps is really critical because of the need for that data to carefully evaluate those settings and those situations. Additionally, the Commission has already identified several potentially stressed areas, and these have been identified because of the identification of a lot of water users in a small area. Some of those areas may also have some contributing factors such as lower yielding aquifers and that kind of thing. Additionally, the Commission has identified several water challenged areas, and the reason there's a distinction there is the water challenged areas are not a result of a large number of users. It's primarily been identified because there's a limitation in the resource available from those aquifers in those areas. So I'll see if Mike has anything else he'd like to add.
Yeah, so not only has the Commission identified some of these areas, but there's also additional areas that are going to be more project specific that need to be addressed through either aquifer testing or through the groundwater availability analysis aspect. So there can be some projects, some cases where there is a significant amount of use on a small scale, local basin, and all of that use may exceed the recharge and would eventually cause what we consider to be aquifer mining, where the groundwater is being withdrawn from storage and not being replenished over time through recharge. So some of those places are going to be identified as you work through some of these steps that Dave and Scott were talking about in the early parts of the webinar, particularly with the groundwater availability aspect. Also, some formations aren't as conducive, like Todd mentioned, to producing water. So there may be some local challenges to water availability that need to be addressed. So that is something that always needs to be looked on at a large scale as well as a smaller scale to make sure that the quantity that you're looking to either develop or renew is reasonably going to be available.
And then I'll also mention that there is a resource available on the Commission's website. It's called the Cumulative Water Use Availability Assessment. And that is a resource that projects and consultants can go to and look at water use in certain watersheds and see what existing water use is in those areas, and then get an idea of what water resources may be available in those particular areas. So if you haven't looked at that, that resource on our website, I'd recommend that you do that. We refer to it often as QWAS, just the acronym. So please check that out if it sounds like it may be helpful to you. I don't see any other questions coming up. I'll just mention a couple things and see if anybody else has any questions they'd like to add into the chat. Just really some high-level key takeaways from this webinar that I'd really like to reinforce, and it's really for renewing and existing projects. When at all possible, we really stress the importance and the value of using existing data as much as possible. And when that existing data is not completely sufficient to support a renewal request, we then really stress and want to reinforce that there are options during normal operations and then even some slightly modified operations to supplement the existing data you have to potentially fill those necessary data gaps. Many times the supplemental data can be collected without a standard standalone aquifer test. And really the question is, why is this important? And it really can avoid a lot of the costs of a standalone aquifer test if you're able to use this existing data and supplement to fill data gaps. The other thing it can do, it can really help you avoid the potential disruptions of completing a standalone aquifer test. Those can be disruptive to certain operations, especially if they have limited sources available to support their project. So I just wanted to mention a couple of those, and we do have another question here that came in. The question is, do you have publication of where water is already being mined unsustainably? And we don't have a standalone publication or document covering that. Like I mentioned before, the potentially stressed areas that have been identified are potential areas where water mining or water withdrawal at rates that are unsustainable could be occurring or have a potential to occur. And I would say generally outside of those areas, we don't have a lot of known widespread areas that are being mined unsustainably, and when we run across those, they're most frequently on a very site-specific, project-specific situations, and occasionally when there are 2 or 3 nearby projects. So hopefully that answers that question. So this would be a good one that Mike can probably answer is, what is an area of influence?
The area of influence for pumping from a well is going to be the area of the aquifer that is being impacted by that withdrawal. So in other words, there's going to be some kind of measurable drawdown that's going to be observed at some point in that aquifer. Areas of influence can vary significantly based on the formation. The pumping rate itself does not have an impact on it. It has an impact on the magnitude of the impact. So people often will confuse, we'll say that 200 gallons a minute is going to have a broader area of impact or area of influence than 100 gallons a minute, but it really just changes the magnitude of the amount of drawdown that's observed. The area of influence tends to, in some places, be elongated along a formation, so you might end up with something that's more of an oval shape or a cigar shape. And I think maybe I was going into too much detail on that, or maybe not quite the right detail, because the follow-up question to that is that 1 foot, 2 foot of drawdown? And I think that's going to be, I think maybe the question is being asked in context of trying to evaluate where the groundwater availability is and what the groundwater basin is. So for that, we're looking at what your expected capture area is going to be and then the contributing basin above it. So, but yes, 1, 2 feet of drawdown certainly is within the area of influence, and it may or may not be within, indicate that there's going to be water flow from that location over to your well. That's also very site-specific and based on a lot of other hydrogeologic information, such as the gradient of the water table.
Great, thanks, Mike. That's all the questions I'm seeing right now. I guess we'll wrap up if we don't have any more questions. Once again, I want to thank everyone for participating. Like I mentioned, we'll have the recording and the FAQ available on our website a few weeks after this webinar. We look forward to the Part 3 water level monitoring webinar that we held on March 25th. We hope everyone can join us. And I also encourage you to reach out to any of the staff using the contact information that was provided in the PowerPoint. If you have any follow-up questions or would like to ask or request a pre-application meeting or about any of these ideas and information that we had for today. So, thanks again.